Welcome to the Combat Learning Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Josh Peacock. If you aren't already, please go to the combatlearning.com/newsletter URL. You can get my Intro to Motor Learning for Martial Artists, which is a paper I wrote that will get you up to speed on the powerful concepts we're discussing in the show. Plus, you'll never miss an episode. That's combatlearning.com/newsletter. Today, we're joined by Scott Sievewright, host of the Primal MMA podcast and an MMA striking coach who teaches a striking program almost entirely on ecological dynamics, or the constraints-led approach to motor learning. In part 1 of 2, Scott and I work through why ecological dynamics is so hard to get the hang of. We have a discussion on how to balance representativeness and safety in training, since greater levels of representativeness make training more like competition and thus more risky. We also talk about when more isolated training methods might be warranted. So if you're excited to jump in, hit the subscribe button on your podcatcher now and enjoy the show.
Yeah, I just recently listened to your newest podcast with Nicola. I forgot her last name.
Hodges.
Okay. Yeah, that was a really good one. And you were talking about Rob Gray when he says that you need to pick one and stick.
Might be doing Rob Gray a tremendous disservice, because I think I say that almost every podcast I have to mention how I love his stuff, but I'm maybe not quite. It's maybe a level or two above my pay grade, and sometimes I may either misinterpret it or take the wrong overall arching message away and go away thinking something else. So there's I've definitely misinterpreted a lot of things he said, and there's proof of it too, because I asked him a question in my first episode, and whatever it was that I forgot what the term was. I think it was like errorless learning or something that he was talking about a lot at that time. And I got it wrong, and he corrected me. So I was like, oh, okay, cool. You came out the gates hard on your podcast with Rob Gray as your first guest.
Yeah, for sure. He wasn't the first one I recorded with, because I had to work up my confidence. But he is the first one that I released. I think he was the fourth. The fourth one that I actually recorded. Yeah, but I wanted to release with something totally different. Than anyone's ever seen. I hadn't discovered your podcast at the time. So I think did you release in 2020? Is that when you started?
Yeah, early 2020. I was playing around with a couple of things. I was playing around with some kind of blogging when I opened my school. It was really important to me. I was getting further and further in the weeds. And then, what it's like, the attention span of anyone these days. And I wasn't taking it personally, but I was putting a lot of time and enjoying writing stuff and whatnot. But and I didn't really care. It was more of an endeavor just to kind of self-educate myself and put some of my ideas out. Then I went on the podcast, and then I don't know. I know I was kind of unbearable the other day on social media, but all it takes sometimes is some stupid, meme to troll the community, and that's what gets the most engagement. I made some post about shrimping being the greatest waste of time in jiu-jitsu, and running around the floor bear crawling, and then everyone got in their camps.
Was that BJJ Fanatics? I think I saw that.
So no, actually, I tried. There's a BJJ everything group, and I actually tried to put it on there, but the admin wouldn't put it on. So this was just on my personal page. Ooh. So it's kind of interesting here,
Yeah.
I don't know whether it upset the sentiments of the admin. Maybe it's something he does, and he didn't like it or whatever. But twice I tried to post it. It's really interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, I've had
jiu-jitsu dorks.
Yeah, for sure. The jiu-jitsu guys think that they're immune to this problem, and as I've said a number of times on the podcast, they are not. They are not immune to this problem. I followed the same development sort of arc. I started with blogging in 2015. And at the time...
And you write very well, by the way. I've read a couple of things you sent me. So.
Oh, thank you. Bravo. I spent a long time on that. But I started with writing on... I called it... what did I call it? Oh, Taekwondo fight, TKD fighter. Because at the time I was doing the whole rigmarole that all the karate and taekwondo adults do when they realize that things weren't as presented to them. So they're trying to come up with reasons to explain why they do things that boxers and people are like, why do you do that? That doesn't make any sense. So there's the whole coping mechanism of trying to figure out what the value of doing forms is and what the value of one steps are and why you do formal versions before doing a more applied version that's more applicable to what you need. And in the process of building these huge, elaborate artifices of why we do things and what the value are, I started to ask myself why I believed those things were true, because I was making up plausible reasons to do it, but I never asked myself if they ever corresponded to reality. And so at the time I was embroiled in a Master of Education in Teaching and Learning. And I was learning about educational psychology and learning and kind of reorganizing how I like learning the technical term of learning as a learned behavior that results from repeated experience or practice or training, right? Learning is not perceptual input or perceptual processing. Just because you watched a video and understood what was going on some level, or you memorized some facts, doesn't mean that learning has taken place. Learning extends into behavior. You have to be able to do something with it. So that was when I started to change, because the first problem is kind of abstract, but the first problem that I thought of was learning. The way I thought of it is, and I think the article's probably still up there on some WordPress somewhere, but the problem that I located for myself, and I didn't know much of anything about motor learning yet at this point. I just discovered it. I certainly didn't know much about ecological dynamics or anything like that. But what the problem as I posed it back then was, if a good Taekwondo sparrer is able to use footwork and targeting and timing to functionally, successfully land a round kick, is that a learned behavior? The answer to that is yes. So when I say something like, I learned a round kick, but I've never used it in sparring, I've only used it in forms, line drills, kicking a target. Can I actually say that I have learned a round kick? My answer to that question was, if learning is oriented towards functional ability to fight, the answer is no. If the orientation of that is that I'm going to be a competitive Pumse athlete, Pumse is Taekwondo for forms, the answer is yes. So there's a fundamental divorce between what it means to learn a technique in the context of formal exercises and something that's like fighting or self-defense. So that was the primitive, and I had so much trouble communicating this to other people in the Taekwondo community, because the way that the sort of practical kata application system works, it kind of warps categories. And so there's kind of a built-in merging of categories and like its own set of terminology and stuff that makes it intrinsically resistant to understanding concepts that would help to actually unravel that and kind of sort things out better. So I knew that with all the opposition I was getting in the community from that I was probably onto something, because nobody was, no matter how many times I tried to rephrase it and use different analogies and stuff, cite sources, like go to the APA and say learning is this, and then try to, just the thing I just told you. It just didn't seem to sink in. So that's when I started to just go deeper into motor learning specifically to figure out how to understand all that kind of stuff. Because it's actually quite, in many ways, it's very different than like educational psychology. The written word is difficult with people's, like we said, with attention. It's difficult to get people to read everything you write. And people scan a lot. So if you write something really critical in the second sentence of a paragraph, they might not see that. And then they're going to fire back in the comments with something that's just, whatever, a straw man or just total misunderstanding of whatever it is you said. And then when you try to clarify that, there's the double down because now they don't want to admit that they didn't read your comment. And so it's just, and to your point, I just did this a couple of days ago. When you say something negative, mean, whatever, you get people to pay attention, but it's in a negative frame of mind. So whenever you're trying to be polite about it, you try to be detailed. I've been made fun of for being eggheaded before. I've got the whole thing. It's like, I don't understand what you're saying, even though I'm using a combination of defined terms. Like I tell you what I mean by this term first and then use it. And terms that are more commonly used in the martial arts, I try to use those too as much as possible. I've tried everything. I'm doing this for like almost 6 years, just having these conversations and trying to work through these problems. And I think I've convinced one person to be constraints led.
Is that your mother?
No, I'm working on her though. She's an occupational therapist. That's an interesting
there you go.
one.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because I see everything through the same lens now.
I do too.
Whether it be parenting, learning something new, it's everything. It's completely changed my world. So
yeah, the ecological, I don't know what to call it, paradigm or whatever, ecological psychology maybe. It makes you appreciate how many things influence, I guess in a system, I guess you'd call it, whether it's just a person or a circumstance. It helps like attractor basins and attractor structures and all that kind of stuff. That was hard to start to understand. And I probably still don't understand it totally. But when you think about that, then you can actually look at subcultures, the way they act, the way they talk, and you can start to pinpoint, okay, here's some things that are happening in this context, some forces in this that are exerting themselves in the system that explain why these behaviors and certain values would emerge over time, right? So now you have this toolbox to understand things on a much better way and on a better scale too. But yeah, it's been a long journey. I'm still trying to figure it out. I have half a mind to stop trying to have the discussions with people. Not entirely, but like trying to talk to people who are asking for advice or people who are giving advice that I would disagree with. I'm thinking maybe I just leave it alone. And then if somebody wants to ask me what I think about something, then I can do it, because I don't know. It's frustrating. People don't they don't want to listen.
Well, I'm coming from a slightly different place in the fact, and I think it's really important to differentiate between what our end goal is here. Okay.
Yeah.
Now I have nothing. Absolutely wonderful. People want to come in. They want to learn forms. They want to learn pads. They want to get a workout. They want to feel like a workout's fun.
Sure.
And the byproduct of that being, some new technical ability and, weight loss, fitness. I'm completely for that.
Yep.
It's just not the product that I'm interested in. I'm interested in how we become skillful performers. Mm-hmm. And I'm also trying to sell product at our gym, product and a service. Yeah. So that's where a lot of it, I feel like I have to keep kind of selling a product because it is largely goes against we'll probably throw the word traditional out there, but the kind of standard model. And that's a reason, I often get told, even I come back to it sometimes with my own partner, maybe we should have a cardio kickboxing class, but it's just not what we do. There's loads of places that can do that. And I think the problem when you have a clear vision on what you were trying to do is then you start trying to chase all the different dollars and whatnot. And I'm comfortable with that. I'm comfortable with doing what we do. And I initially thought this could be for everyone. And to be quite frank, it's not for everyone. Mm-hmm. And that's fine. Now, the gamble we make is there enough of the people who do want to do that can make a sustainable business going forward? And it appears the early signs is it's going to be a slower growing. The trajectory upwards of member count and whatnot will be slower, but I think it'll be a more robust and sustainable model at the end of the day.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's going to be, especially for adults, the contention I have for sort of backdoor secondary argument I have for people that push back on those grounds. So when I try to talk to a lot of Taekwondo guys, one of the things that comes up is like, well, it's a disingenuous argument, by the way. I know it's a disingenuous argument that they make, but it's one of those things that they do to kind of throw red herrings out. But they'll say something like, well, I don't do it just to be good at self-defense or to be a fighter or to be a competitor. I do it to have fun and to stay in shape. And the immediate answer to that is, first of all, sparring is way more fun, and it is just incredibly better for keeping you in shape. Doing a regular in Taekwondo, I mean, there's karate too, and a lot of other martial arts that do these hybrid style classes where there's not a lot of sparring and there's not a lot of, everything's very kind of rote, and it's just not very cardio intensive. You do an uninspired warm up, and then you do a lot of like one step type of stuff. That is terrible fitness. And a lot of people there are fat and overweight, and they just go and they work up a little bit of a sweat for 15 minutes. They do easy scripted stuff for the next 45 minutes. They go home and they feel like they did something productive. Their conception, that's fine, but their conception of it is not accurate, because the fitness is almost useless.
Right.
You're not burning that much calories at all. And obviously you can't burn enough calories to outpace a bad diet, but there are other benefits to sustained cardio for your heart, right? And you're not getting those things if you're not sustaining that for more than 15 minutes. And sparring is just, it's better for, if you want to be, if you want to be better at fighting, if you want to have a chance at defending yourself, dynamic exercises, positional drills, and sparring are the absolute best way to accomplish all those things at the same time. And usually, like, people don't usually respond to that, but they'll say something like, well, it's not for everyone. I'm like, okay, but you do martial arts.
Yeah. And presumably something's attracted them to the sport. And what I've found is that when people do feel they can spar safely with in a responsible culture. Now I'm not talking about, we might cover headshots later.
For sure.
The natural consequence of that. Okay. That's a given. That's something I'm very, very passionate about trying to get it right. But anyway, let's leave that to the side just now. What I've found is that when you build a good sparring culture and a safe sparring culture, it's just thoroughly rewarding. Yeah. And I've been speaking a lot recently more about the opportunity cost of poor or inefficient practice design. And when it's a one-side drill, for me, that's at least 50% of the time for the passive partner or whatever. That's out the window from the get-go.
Right.
From the get-go. So you're already starting at a 50% deficit as far as I'm concerned.
Yep.
And perhaps if there is value in it, you're already again 50% behind.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that this is appreciated by people who aren't within the ecological space, but when you understand it, it becomes an ethical issue, in my opinion. And I do want to talk about the opportunity cost for a second, but I want to circle back to the podcast you did before we go on to that, because I didn't get.
And can I just jump in quickly there?
Yeah, go ahead.
Before you go, in mixed martial arts, and I've been thinking about this recently. There's effectively, okay, maybe, there's a whole bunch of different sports. We couldn't, they're similar, but actually grappling and kickboxing are completely different. For me, that's soccer and basketball.
Yeah.
And if you're trying to get good at them both, then opportunity cost takes on a whole new meaning and a whole new value. We just don't have the time. If we consider time, and I consider time and our training partners to be our two most unequivocally valuable commodities.
Absolutely. Especially when you have people that want to get better, but they're recreational.
Yeah.
They're not professional. That's absolutely. But what I wanted to say about the podcast was when you talked about, I don't know if you're misunderstanding Rob Gray so much as, I forgot the way I was going to position that, but it's
go ahead. I'm thick-skinned, so if you think I'm completely misinterpreting them,
no.
And I'm speaking specifically on his contrast and compare of the IP and the ecological approach. Yeah.
So I think you're attributing that statement to a different layer of you're attributing what he's talking about to the actual training methods instead of the theoretical account of because obviously there's a big difference. So
can you elaborate on that then?
Yeah, absolutely. So when he says that, and I've heard him say it a few times, where it clicked for me was in a presentation he released a few months ago where he was talking about the differences between the constraints-led approach and traditional approaches to designing practices, and the way that they account for motor control and things like that, how they explain those things, right? So when I say account for, this is basically like a scientific way of saying this is the explanation for how these things occur, how they're governed, and why they behave the way that we observe. When he says that, he's talking about your conception of motor control and adaptation and learning, which is very different in ecological dynamics and constraints-led approach versus information processing, right? So if you buy the and much of the account is mutually exclusive to the other. Information processing and all that stuff is in constraints-led approach or ecological dynamics, but it is conceived of slightly differently, and its role is somewhat different than information processing. So even though there's some overlap, most of the beliefs between the two systems are mutually exclusive to one another. So if you buy the ecological dynamics account of how adaptation happens and constraints and how those things sort of operate on a system to produce adaptations and learning, because we in the ecological dynamics system we see learning as an adaptation, right? It's not merely a transfer of knowledge; it's actually an adaptation to forces. Then there's no reason to pick and choose from information processing because everything is sort of baked into ecological dynamics. So even though there are some things that you're going to lose from IP, like some ideas around like representation and schema, right? Mm-hmm. That stuff is accounted for and understood in different ways in ecological dynamics. So you don't need to pick and choose from the two because each one is structured carefully such that those elements build on each other. So if you try to pick and choose from both of them, you're going to break either one of the systems. Mm-hmm. You're going to end up with a dysfunctional approach, basically. I don't think he means that you can't use something like a direct instruction or isolated practice, like you can't ever use it. I've been writing just kind of as an intellectual exercise, writing a paper trying to summarize how motor control works in like in sparring. And it's really hard to summarize. It's really difficult to make it concise, but it's one of the things I've done is I've had to go and reread some of these texts again. And they reposition what instruction is in the system. And one of the ways they do it is the first of all, like cut down feedback, cut down the level of detail, and try to make it the instruction more about creating a constraint, right? So make it external focus of attention, make it more descriptive of what you're trying to do in the exercise, or what you're trying to accomplish in the exercise, more than exactly what you have to do to accomplish it, right? So there's a lot of things like in like a traditional approach, they're going to be like, okay, you want to get this points, you want to score with this surface area, and you have to do these things. Oh, and here's how you do it, right? And then there's like another 5 to 10 minutes of just instruction about every little detail. Excuse me, under a constraints-led approach, you still are giving some instruction, but it's different in the sense that you're trying to help direct their attention, and then you're trying to tell them what it is they need to do, and then let them sort of fill in the gap. And then the secondary function of direct instruction is if manipulating constraints and using like questioning and those sorts of tools continue to fail, then you can use that as a remedial tool, as a way to manage motivation. Because obviously if people are accustomed to traditional instruction, and when you as a coach just continue to let somebody fail without giving them the answer, you're probably doing the right thing, but they're not going to perceive it that way. So their motivation is going to take a big hit, and their conception of the product or the service that you offer is also going to take a hit too. So and motivation also has downline effects on learning too, because if your motivation gets lower, your learning is not going to improve. So you're managing a lot as a coach. And so there's an affective element to it where maybe you do have to step back and do some isolated drill, just a little bit of isolated drilling, so that somebody who's not responding to manipulation of constraints, questioning, and any of those sort of tools that you have gets an idea of what they should do directly from you, and then can work from there. Almost like, if you're a young man, most young men can do a couple of pull-ups. The problem is getting strong enough to do 10 or 20 in sequence, right? But occasionally, and especially with young women too, occasionally they don't have an athletic background. They didn't run around growing up. There's any number of reasons why that they're too weak to do a pull-up. So you start from a negative and let yourself down until you get enough. You've strengthened enough of the muscles to get your one pull-up. I'm
glad you're brushing on that too, because again, it's really important to me. So two things that they jump out at me. You said to me, it could be some of the more traditional direct instruction could be used perhaps as a supplement when perhaps the learner isn't not fully embraced, or perhaps the teacher or the practice designer doesn't fully understand or hasn't come wholly skillful in using the ecological approach. So it can be used as a kind of bridge for now. And I think that's where I'm using it. The second point there, and I know as much as I try and learn here, I think it's important to be somewhat of a reductionist sometimes and get it down to rules of thumb for students, especially students. 95% of people, they want to come in. Of course, some of them get excited about it, but they don't really care. They're not really caring about the science. They're not passionate, and that's fine. They're not quite as engaged with the science of it all, I think they begin to care when they see the rapid development. But for me, it's been just like you said. For the analogy you used of the pull up there is that I think what I'm talking to my coaches now is let's start off at just incrementally more challenging real scenarios, and make it again. It's come back the challenge point 3, blah blah blah, but really start off there. And I mean that's why we start off in our foundations. We shoulder tap just to spar, and everyone can kind of manage that. They know how to slap someone and slapping on the shoulders, and we just build from there and just incrementally add the difficulty and challenge over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And manipulating constraints, it's so, I don't know that there's anyone on earth right now that has an excellent idea of how to do that for martial arts. It's been built out in other sports, but combat sports is, it has so many additional layers of chaos that some sports don't have. Even more so, well, I mean, you have the team element, which is really chaotic. So that's one thing that's one case of ecological dynamics constraints led approach being used successfully in like soccer or football. But I don't see a lot of examples of it being used in combat sports training. And when there is ecological research done in a combat sport, it's artificially artificially limited in some way. So an example is there's a study about the emergent which punches emerge at particular ranges, right? So range metastability. And what the way it was measured was on a bag. So they're like, you get your straights in the longer range, whatever. I forgot what they called that range at approximately this relative distance. And then when you get closer, you get your hooks. And when you're in clinch range, the uppercuts emerge. And any boxing coach could have told you that, but they got some evidence, I guess, for the emergent thing that they were trying to talk about. But I think the range of tactics would change if they were actually measuring what happens when he's fighting an opponent.
Right.
I think it would change. I think that you would actually see crossover. You would see punches that are normally longer range happening at shorter ranges. You would see shorter range punches sometimes happening at longer ranges. And you would have probably a really cool understanding of what emerges where. I
wonder how much of that comes down to the kind of ethical restrictions of having people actually punch at each other.
I mean, I assume they're using actual boxers, so they could just look at sparring matches. There was some research done on Taekwondo sparring where they were able to do that, and the research that came out of there's two pieces of research. One of the pieces of research was that they're both on. One of them was on affective learning, and the other one was on range. The range one, they found that in practice, the fighters stay farther away from each other because the anxiety is lower and the I want to say compunction. I don't know if that's the right word. They weren't compelled to score as much because it's just training. Yeah. So when they actually get into an actual match, they stay closer because they're trying to score. So they naturally stay closer, but they're not training at that range. Right. So I guess a constraints-led approach to fixing one of that would be either find a way to make them more worried about scoring or make the ring smaller, so they're forced to work in that range. The other one found that that sparring training was not successful at raising the anxiety to the level of competition.
Well, no shit. But and you know, I've seen a lot of sparring out there. I think the anxiety level in some gyms is plenty enough to recreate fights. Sure. But again, I've picked this is something I keep coming back to. Again, we said we're going to touch on it.
Sure.
I'm just not comfortable with, especially the students I have in the first year or two that are just dipping their toes in the sport. I'm just not comfortable with battering each other on the head. And if I'm losing, if that's not achieving the optimal arousal, I'm okay with that just now.
Yeah.
When the cost benefit analysis comes and these are professionals trying to get to the next level, that's a whole other conversation to have.
Right.
Where we can wrap it up. I'm just not there yet. So I'm comfortable where I'm just now. And if I have to give something up, which might be the authentic level of anxiety, then that's what I've chosen to do right now. Yeah,
I think if you have to give up representativeness, that's probably the first one you should give up. And then if somebody volunteers to compete, that's where you start to introduce probably the harder sparring at a slow trickle, because it's not sustainable over a long period of time. There was, I haven't published it yet, but I have a conversation. I just forgot his name all of a sudden. He's been on Stewart's podcast a few times. He's out of Skill Acquisition Ireland.
Oh, is it Richie Ford, perhaps? Is he a Taekwondo guy?
He's a Taekwondo guy. I don't think it's Richie Ford, though. Hold on. I got the thing right here. Alan Dunton.
Oh, okay.
He's an ITF guy, yeah. Or he was an ITF guy. I think he still coaches a little bit, but doesn't really practice anymore. So I had a conversation with him, and we had a conversation about trying to introduce representative levels of anxiety safely. And one of the things he proposed was adding some additional consequence after if you lose, something like some sort of exercise that you hate, like 80 consecutive burpees or something ridiculous, something grueling and that would make you distraught. So you have that on your mind. There's some other things he came up with, stuff around like points and stuff like that could encourage additional levels of having skin in the game in some way, so where you're more competitive, and you're putting pressure on yourself. So there's some level of anxiety. So it's maybe not entirely perfectly representative, but close enough. I think that if you have a relatively safe sport, so you're doing MMA, which is not relatively safe, but with Taekwondo at the black belt level, it's technically full contact, and you can knock somebody out if you want to. You can kick somebody full force in the head. But one of the things they've done to try and make the sport a little bit safer, even at the elite level, this is Olympic Taekwondo, is they've made it to where scoring on the head doesn't require as much pressure. And so a lot of the times, and people make fun of it, but I don't really care. I think it's fine, because you're not, it's just a sport. It's fun. So you see that guys, they'll pop each other pretty good in the head, but they're not knocking each other out as much anymore as they used to. And it still happens, but that incentive is actually successfully caused lighter contact to the head in the course of real competition. I forgot where I was going with that, but that is one way that they've tried to, limit CTEs and all that kind of stuff. in Olympic Taekwondo, and they've gotten pretty good at it. But I understand you can't really do that in boxing.
And boxing actually is I ran an amateur boxing team for a year or so, and it didn't really. Again, it's a constant dilemma for me. I have two sons of my own. I don't want them getting hit in the head, but here I am with other people's sons, so I take it very seriously. One thing we introduced last month, actually, in our gym, we got a cage. We had a novice MMA, which, of course, we didn't invent that, but it's tough. There's not too much opportunity around where we are. There's another club that do it, but we had the walkout music. We had the commentator and all the fans, and blah blah blah, and so that was as representative as it gets. Yeah, fighting in front of your mum and dad and your boyfriend or your girlfriend or whatever, and the crowd cheer and blah blah blah. So that was a tremendous success, actually, and I hope to be putting it on every couple of months to get that kind of level of representative up there. Without, of course, it's not wholly realistic, but I keep reminding them, a real fight, there are no rules. So even every competitive combat sport you pick, there are rules. This is just a little more constrained. Yeah. And I think it's offering a good opportunity for these, if you're going to I've been telling them, if you're going to take a big shit under the lights, you might as well do it when there's no head contact.
Yeah. You just reminded me where I was going with that. And that is when you have a relatively safe competitive environment, competing more is the way that you get more representative training. It should be considered a part of your training regimen to compete more, especially on like a local level where the stakes are, you still have that anxiety, but you're not necessarily giving up your ability to go to nationals or compete on the Olympic team or the world team. But that's a great way that you've found a way to constrain the intensity while bringing in peers, family, and other loved ones to watch, which creates an additional layer of anxiety to perform.
I think it almost mirrors anxiety because one, I didn't have I had a short amateur career. I took up the sport relatively late. Mm-hmm. And the anxiety was never really about getting hurt. Mm-hmm. The anxiety was about losing in front of my friends. Training and just walking out, with my head down. That was where all the anxiety came. And I think we were able to perfectly recreate that in our last event. Yeah. So that's going to be our model now. If kid comes in and they want to fight, and when I say kid, Josh, I have to remind people that's anyone under 40 to me. But if they want to come in, and we don't allow any head contact for teenagers or below. And again, I have my I can be talked out of that. There's shades of grey there, but that's where we are. But anyone who wants to fight will be on a fight team. They will be required to do at least 3 to 4 of the pancreation or novice MMA events. Yeah. What I just jotted this down here because I'm always trying to be devil's advocate with myself. So if we and largely we do this, right? I say don't worry about technique. That should emerge over time. Either works or it does not work. And you'll find movement solutions. They don't need to be an ideal movement. But, we both know, familiar with the invariant features of that. There's certain characteristics that are going to appear anyway. Right. Perfect technique's also unachievable right away. It takes time. Yeah. It takes time. But one thing, a podcast before last with Dr. James Stafford, which was one of my favorites, actually. And he was talking about the perception action loop, and there's 2 things going on here. You're perceiving, but you know whether you have the action capability or not. Yeah. And I think for me that maybe, again, I'm trying to have maybe my cake and eat it or play devil's advocate, that perhaps there's a time to practice the technique to get somewhat of a technical move down. And that will just maybe offer this self-belief or at least that you have this action capability. Mm-hmm. Let me say, for somebody, I've been doing the sport a long time, a spinning wheel kick. I know it's not an action capability of mine. Mm-hmm. I would never use it. So no matter whether that opportunity or the affordance is there within a sparring match or a fight, I won't use it because I don't have that action capability. Would that perhaps be a rationale for training a little bit out of context?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot you could do that where you don't have to decouple, like for like a regular round kick. But for something like a spinning kick, a lot of spinning kicks are also to the head too. So you have to be careful. So I think that I wouldn't just do it. I wouldn't do it on a bag necessarily. I wouldn't introduce it on the bag anyways. And I wouldn't do it totally statically. But I would get, in Taekwondo, we use kick paddles a lot. So I would put the paddle, near my head, so that the distancing is as close to representative as possible. I give them a couple, just work up their confidence, give them a couple of static reps, but then immediately start moving around, because you want to make those perturbations in the system, make it unstable, so that they get that feedback loop. So they're going to adjust. So they are going to fail. But you don't have to zip around as fast as you can. You just kind of move around a little bit and start letting them figure out how to target, and then you can raise the intensity. The reason why I say that is because there was actually I have a story that illustrates it pretty well. And that's I used to teach for a charity karate organization, and they would go into low income communities and they would open up these clubs that were pretty low cost, and the kids could come and they could learn karate for really low price. They didn't have to pay like $150 a month, and they could get some training. But the program was very traditional, very linear, and it has a lot of constraints around it, and there's no adaptations made to the program at all. So they used to brag that it was a long program because you have to learn everything the same way you would if you were going to go 3 times a week at a karate school, but you only have once a week, right? So it could take 8 years to get a black belt. One of the problems with the program was that sparring was infrequent, it wasn't required, and they rarely did it. So everything's done in the air, entirely decoupled from a moving opponent. There's no consideration made for learning interpersonal distancing, timing, recognizing affordances, nothing, none of that. Everything is done in the air or or not even on pads, on like a kick shield, maybe sometimes with noodles, but mostly kick shields and in the air. And then you would have like 1-step stuff with a partner occasionally. And that was the extent of the program. So one of the days I was there, they actually did do sparring, and I'm not a very good sparrer. That's the type of program I came up with as a kid. So my development even after doing martial arts now for like 20 years, my development there is actually very far behind of my actual experience, because that's how I came up through martial arts.
I think most of us can.
Yeah.
Test that.
Yeah. And, but I was just wiping the floor with these kids without any effort at all. And the reason what was happening was, I was just doing really basic Taekwondo stuff, like a cut kick, which is like a lead leg side kick. And I would use that like a jab so I could understand where the distance was. And then I would follow up. And then I would also disrupt anything that they wanted to do with that. And I was cutting angles and things that they had never been taught, never practiced before. And I'm good at getting off the line and moving out of the way when they would try to advance. So the kids were just throwing random techniques in sequence.
Right.
And they were, one of the kids that I was sparring with was actually the assistant instructor. She got so upset that she tried to bull rush me. And even when she bull rushed me, I just cut an angle and got a clinch, deep, whatever. No, it was whatever. She couldn't figure it out. And what was going on was their training is not just decoupled, but it has trained their brains to think in such a decoupled way that they actually think, they actually believe, they truly believe that throwing back fists and spinning crescent kicks and roundhouse in random order might land if they just throw enough of them without footwork, angles, looking for affordances, nothing. That's it. They just throw it in a scripted sequence, change up the sequence every time you do it, and eventually you'll land. That's what they think is going to happen.
But to be honest, perhaps it does work against people who are training the exact same way, because they're not they're not perceiving either. They're not perceiving.
So that's a good point. That's a good point, because I did see some of the kids tagging each other, and I think one of the reasons for that is, again, they're not perceiving. So they're all just making actions at the same time because they want to score. They're definitely not getting any good coaching. But when you have somebody who's not just trying to score, I'm just, being evasive, then I'll come in and I'll get a hit and then I'll move back out. And I'll come in and get a hit and I'll move back out. Or I'll stick around in the pocket and like suck up the space, which is something that they never do. They always go back out. They don't even know what's going on. They don't understand. They don't even have a concept of how to understand it. And that's why I think it's important that you actually have an actual person there who is holding it. If you have to hold a target, that you're holding it near the actual information source or the target where you want them to hit in real life, so that the distancing is as honest as possible, and they're also actually reading your movements and the way you're opening and closing space, even if it's slower, in the context of throwing the kick. In fact, you can go another step forward and even have them, instead of just throwing a spinning kick, you can have them work towards getting in the range by using other tactics, because spinning kicks rarely emerge on their own. Occasionally you'll see like a counter spin kick out of something that wasn't really set up by any preceding techniques. It was more of like a space thing. But attacking spin kicks never emerge on their own. They always have some sort of preceding combination that masks it, and usually creates the opening. If you have a really skilled kicker, they're not just trying to mask it and get one over on you. They're actually trying to create the opening by fracturing your attention in different areas. So even if you're, and I think it's okay if you're just introducing them, just to have them do that technique, but I wouldn't stay there for very long, because it's a little more frustrating to make it more representative, but you don't really lose anything. It doesn't become a lot less unsafe if you just tell them, hey, start working your cut kick and your round kicks to try and set this up and create openings, and then just let them work a little bit. And then as you start to see patterns where they're faulting, then you can start asking them questions and giving them feedback to help guide them in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree. Something I've been playing around with the last week or two, again, rather than just talk ad nauseum about the philosophy, I've been breaking them up into groups of two or couples, pairs, and I've been calling it the each one teach one exchanges. So I'll have them go off to the side. I say 5 minutes on the clock now. You guys work something out. Whatever you want to do. It could be one single technique. It could be a strategy. It could be a bit of footwork, whatever. Okay, you're just going to drill it, play it back and forward. And after the 5 minutes, it's nice because I see them chattering and the engagement goes way up, because you're giving them autonomy to try something. And I say, okay. Yep. And then at the end of 5 minutes, I mix them all up. Go and try it live. And the failure rate is astronomical. I mean, it's almost 100% failure. And this is, and my end, my conclusion, or how I try and remind them, I said, if you cannot do this live, and you may be able to do it live if you practice, of course you'll be able to do it live if you practice long enough. But this is it's for my way of highlighting the difference between doing it in context and out of context, and it's rarely there. And so that's been that's something I'm probably going to adopt going forward. I really like that. Again, gives them that bit of autonomy. Another thing here, I just jotted down here, kind of all over the place. The conversation I had with James Stafford and talking about being, and Rob uses it as well, that kind of current future, that almost subconsciously picking up on the cues. Can't even verbalize it. And I'm finding this really fascinating concept at the moment. And my partner, Ben, who's just, of course I'm biased, a phenomenal grappler. He's such a good guard game. But he's such a good guard game that people are rarely in side control on him. And so he's just not as strong when he's on the bottom in side control.
Yeah.
And the reality is he just hasn't been there enough.
Right.
And this is our job, I feel now as coaches, is to identify these areas of deficiency or inadequacy, and put them there more often.
Yep.
And Danaher was talking about that the other day. He was, I'd read more of Danaher's stuff if he could learn how to use a fucking paragraph. But he was talking about the other day, it was surprising how when someone has like their signature move or very, very good in a particular position, how they're just not nearly as strong on the defensive end of that.
Right.
And again, that speaks to what we're talking about. You need familiarity with that particular situation.
That also highlights the difference between, and that's not to say that I think John Danaher almost certainly comes from an information processing approach, whether he knows it or not. But he also recognizes that if you're not under that stress, you're not going to make an adaptation. So that highlights the difference between the theoretical difference between an information processing approach and a constraints-led approach or an ecological approach. That we can anticipate that anytime you don't find yourself in a space as much as another, that the adaptation will be weaker. Right. Whereas in an information processing approach, if you get taught the move, your instructor expects you to do it. You quote unquote learned it, right? Mm-hmm. And so even if it's not perfect, they expect you to be stronger there than they find you. And that's where I know that before I learned any of this stuff as an instructor, I haven't taught in years, but when I was teaching, I would often be like, man, I taught you this already, dude. What's going on? Like, why can't you? I had no concept and no understanding. So I know that just being in the martial arts community for so long across so many different styles and different gyms and schools, that there are coaches that are just absolutely at their wits' end with some students because they don't understand they don't understand how performance, learning, instruction, and like contextual practice, like representative practice, how those things interact and what you should realistically expect. One of the main ones, this is one of my favorite ones because when I learned it, it blew my mind, is that incremental gains in technical performance online, that is during practice, are not necessarily going to be retained in another practice.
Right. And
it's not an indicator at all that it will be contained. In fact, failure to do it might be a better indication that it'll emerge next time, because if they were practicing under the correct condition, under the proper conditions, they failed because their body is trying to troubleshoot all the different perceptual skills they need to develop to make the technique work that they didn't have. Mm-hmm. So over the next two practices, over the next, week or so, or, how many practices you do, you might see the technique actually progressively get better on the long term, even without coaching, because they're actually building those little skills that they need. This is what I call them, like intermediate skills, which is probably not good ecological terminology, but they build all these little perceptual skills that you don't get from isolated practice in order to make the technique work. So instructors get aggravated, and I know I did, when they show you something, they give you instructions or coaching feedback, and you do it and it looks good, and then you don't do it the next time. You come back to practice 2 days later and it sucks again.
And what do we say? Let's decouple this again.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do the wrong thing that did not produce retention again. And what actually usually happens, especially when you're teaching with kids, is, and this is terrible, and I really felt bad about this when I really learned this is an actual phenomenon, is you start to make inferences about the intentionality and the earnestness of the student.
Right.
And that begins to subconscious, even if you're not overt about it. Some coaches are, right? Some coaches are abusive about it. I remember one of my friends was in football, and football coaches are just notorious for that sort of coaching. But even if you don't do that, it's going to subconsciously manifest in the way that you talk, in your demeanor, in the way that you conduct yourself with that person. And I know that I think you said that you had listened to the podcast I did with Dr. Rosenthal.
Was he the Harvard, Stanford, one of the?
He was at Harvard.
Extremely off the charts, pleasant and helpful.
Oh yes, one of the most pleasant persons I've ever talked to. Yes, yeah. That his research shows how even if you try to hide it, what you expect and believe about a student affects their outcomes.
Was he was somewhat instrumental in the whole Pygmalion effect, or the original studies on that, right?
Yep. Yeah. So originally he drew fire to himself because of researcher expectancies. So he showed how researcher biases were muddying up scientific studies. Mm-hmm. And then he went into schools and showed that, and this is probably the even more controversial one, the way that the attitudes, even the hidden attitudes that teachers have towards their students affect their student outcomes significantly.
Yeah.
And he showed that with a little bit of a placebo effect. He basically went in there, he did an IQ test on all these kids. So he knew which kids had high IQs, but he randomized which ones were the ones that had potential. And guess what? Lo and behold, all the kids that had potential turned out really well, except their IQs wouldn't have predicted it. So there's a disparity there. And one of his explanations was that they're warmer, they teach more, they're patient, they're more patient, and there's more teaching involved. And one of the things from approaching, you're talking about ecological approach changes how you approach everything. When I thought about that, I was like, well, there's probably an ecological explanation too. They might use different methods, right? They might. They might challenge them more.
I've been thinking about this a lot in this last week because, and I know it's not the same, but it's kind of akin to the Matthew effect. And I wanted to talk to my team and say it's really important we build a culture where it doesn't matter who you're training with. You can find a way to self-constrain and get something out of that. Because what I see what's happening sometimes is the perhaps let's just say the more competent students tend to go to and partner up with the more competent students, or you'll see ones that are perhaps perceived as less competent, they get left out a bit more. And this is such a compounding effect. Yeah. And unfortunately, it's perhaps maybe for I've got to be very careful what I say. Perhaps I see it perhaps with women, right? In BJJ. Okay. Or the guys we're not, I'm going to maybe avoid going with the female on this one or whatever. That only makes things worse. Yeah. And that compounds on. And then these people are left thinking, well, why am I not getting any better? And that's a whole other psychological self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Yeah. That's, I have my friend, the only one that I've ever convinced of the constraints-led approach. He's a great coach. He used to teach with me when I was teaching before for a time. And he strives to teach all the children the same way, but and I was the same way. He also had happen to be like, yeah, that kid's probably not going to be that good, or yeah, that guy, he's not going to, you know. And we've had a lot of discussions on that. I'm like, you know, you gotta, and he doesn't believe this. He doesn't believe this, but I'm like, we as coaches, we have to, even though we know on a statistical level that it's very unlikely any of our students are going to end up being like super top elite level, we have to treat every single one of them like they have that potential. So we can't withhold any, we can't change our coaching feedback because we think that maybe they can't handle, that they won't get to that level. We can't change their participation. Like, we need to let everyone participate in a way that's going to maximally allow them to reach their potential, regardless of whether or not we think they have potential to become an elite level athlete. And, you know, who knows? Some people surprise you. There are people that you would never think would have been elite level athletes, and whatever ecological confluence of experience and events come to happen, and they end up being, you know, you have relatively short people that end up in the NBA, right? People that they would have said you're not going to make it, you're not over 6'5" or whatever the threshold is. You know, people who's competed in baseball where they're, you know, from like the whole Moneyball thing, right? Where their technique and their timing and their aesthetics were off. And all the best coaches in the world would have said they're not going to make it, but the statistics don't lie, right? They might look funky, but they can produce the results, and they can compete on that level. So for me, it's like, never say never to something, and like never say they're not going to be able to do that. I don't think that is incongruent with also being individualized and recognizing that limitations that someone has presently versus where they could end up later. Because you never know how well somebody can adapt to get around things. MMA has really demonstrated that a lot. So you have people, you would think that the way MMA has gone, that you really have to be pristine at everything to win an MMA. But you have people that have such funky games that don't look traditionally tight, that don't look, it doesn't look fundamental. It doesn't look sound in every way. They do stuff that people would call a mistake. But they make it work, and they make it work at the highest level. And
is there a point to be made that the fact that they are unorthodox throws off the traditional or the cookie cutter or the technically sound people, you know?
There's a strategic element to it, but they make it work because they do different things with manipulating space and timing. I don't know that for example, if you don't fight southpaws very often, you come up against a southpaw. That would be one of you know, yeah, my that's obviously gonna jar you, but that's not something an elite level athlete can't compensate for. I think there's more to be said for unorthodox styles than just I don't know what to call it, tactical or strategic perturbations. Yeah. That is helpful. It's helpful. But then you have people like I think, is it Dominic Cruz?
Who's now hawking. I'm a big Dominic Cruz fan, but he's now hawking solo footwork drills to be better at fighting.
Oh, nice. That's why Rob Gray says you shouldn't copy what elite people do. Get elite.
Let's just close that out, though.
Yeah. But he had like a really funky striking style.
Yes, he did, and he
made it work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Against the elite, and of course, at the end of the day, they have a brand. They have, you know, part of me is like, man, if you can make a ton of money out of whatever you're selling, go have at it, right? The longer that's perpetuated, there's room for the athletes that we're trying to produce. Just to close that out about the Matthew effect, the Pygmalion effect, it's one thing to be self-aware and recognize that this is an issue. It's entirely another thing to be consistent with it or deal with it properly, because
absolutely.
I'm self-aware. You know, I try to consider myself always thinking critically, but I'm sure I'm as biased or have as many favorites as most other coaches. And
of course. Yeah. There's interpersonal reasons why too. Some people are just easier to get along with.
Right.
For sure. I had some students that just didn't like, not many, but there was just a couple that were, and to be honest, I should have just, well, there's some adults one I didn't like either, but I really should have just disliked their parents, not the kids. I'm older now, so I have a little better understanding of how that works, but I should have disliked their parents. But yeah, I absolutely agree. Thanks so much for listening to the Combat Learning Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. It really helps us out. Finally, this episode, including the intro music, is produced by Micah Peacock. Thanks in advance, and I'll see you on the next episode.